members in Vietnam. By 1964, that had increased to somewhere between 16,000 and 23,000. 2 years later, in 1966, there were 250,000 plus service members in Vietnam. And in 1968, there were over 550,000 serving in Vietnam. And as quickly as the buildup happened, it went the other way. In 1969, we started the drawdown. And by 1973, we were out of Vietnam. And in 1975, South Vietnam fell to the communists. But this first time in history, as I recollect, that we got into a conflict, a war, where we just incrementally moved into it. Most of the buildup and most of the fighting was done by presidential proclamation, and Congress was very minimally involved. There were a couple of resolutions passed, but there was not the commitment of the country to go to Vietnam. It was our first large-scale guerrilla war, and what that meant was there were no front lines. It didn't matter where you were assigned in country, you were likely to be in combat. If you talk to veterans of World War II, by and large, there was a front line and a distinct area where you were making contact with the enemy. In Vietnam, they were everywhere. Probably most important to us that served, it was an unpopular war. There was an aversion to our involvement almost from day one, and that dislike of the war, or of our participation in it, grew to a crescendo by 1968, after Tet of 68, to the point that it just drowned out everything else. And so those of us who served felt and heard that. Another real impact on us was through this buildup and through the drawdown, we assigned units to Vietnam. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 1st Infantry Division that I was in. But once you were there, you served a one-year tour, and all replacements came as what we called individual replacements. So we didn't take a unit out and replace it with another unit. We just sent people individually to fill those units that were there. And that had a real impact on how you operated. In fact, that's one of the lessons learned from Vietnam that the military has never done again, because it dramatically impacted unit cohesion, it impacted how combat proficient you were, how well you operated, because you changed people in and out almost on a daily basis. And finally, there were no front lines. Everybody was in combat. The cooks and the clerks manned bunkers on the edges of the fire bases, just like the infantrymen did. The transportation people and the MPs, military police, ran convoys all over the country, largely through hostile territory, so they were just as likely to be in combat, just as likely to run into a landmine as any combat unit was. And then there were the helicopters. Helicopters were designed primarily for transportation, or to move supplies. In Vietnam, we used them for everything. They were used for medevac, they were used as gunships, they were used to take troops into combat, they were used for their normal function of transporting supplies, but they were just everywhere and used entirely different than they'd ever been used before. Even with these differences, combat experience there was similar to that you would find anywhere. We were mostly young men from diverse backgrounds. It was still during the draft, so many of the people who were there had gotten that special letter from the president that said, "You're invited to come join us." Or there were a lot of them like myself that went ahead and joined because we knew the letter from the draft board was about to come, and we joined to have a little more control over when and where we went. Regardless of the background, combat helped us grow up fast. We learned a lot about ourselves. We learned to be part of a team. We learned to depend on our fellow soldier and to have each other's back. We learned about leadership and heroism and the devastation of losing a fellow soldier. And we learned to laugh at the ironies of war. Now, I could easily stand here for an hour and tell you war stories about that 1 year I spent in combat. I won't do that. Most soldiers don't really like to talk about combat, and I am of that same ilk. But I will tell you a couple of stories about the ironies of war. To me, the little funny things. The unit I was with, the 1st Infantry Division, occupied a portion of South Vietnam that kind of stretched from the Cambodian border over to the capital of Saigon. It was a pretty large area, but it was also the primary infiltration route for North Vietnamese regular forces down into the south. And that's how they brought in their soldiers and their supplies. There's also what we call the rocket belt, because the local Viet Cong loved to go out at night and set up rockets and fire them into the fire bases. Now, the rockets were fairly inaccurate. They made a big explosion, and every once in a while they'd hit an important target. They'd blow up helicopters, or and occasionally people would get killed that way. But it was if you were on the fire base, it disrupted your life, because almost every night, somewhere in the night, the sirens would go off. We'd jump out of our bunks, we'd run to a bunker, hunker down there till the all clear was sounded, and then go back and try and get a little more sleep. Well, most of the time, as infantrymen, we weren't in the fire bases. We were out in what we call the boonies, in ambush positions, and along this area, we were looking for the enemy. We were trying to find them before they could shoot those rockets off. Now, we weren't very successful. We just spent a lot of nights out there, and we would hear the whoosh as the rocket would take off. Whoosh, whoosh. I'd get on the radio, and I'd call the Tactical Operations Center at the fire base and say, "You got incoming rockets?" And about the time they'd say, "Roger," you'd hear them landing. Boom, boom. And then we'd just kind of sit there and laugh, because we were the infantry. We were out there trying to catch them, but they were the ones catching the enemy's brunt of his action, and we were safer than they were. Kind of ironic, I thought. One other little story. We all think of Vietnam as being hot and miserable and sweaty and steamy, and it was, just about 99% of the time. But one of my memories of Vietnam is one night we were in base camp, and we were a reaction force, and we got a call that there was a major contact going on. And it was just about dark. We ran out to the helicopters, we loaded in, we took off. By the time we got to where they wanted us to be, it was dark. The helicopter pilot said, "All right, you're here." We jumped out right in the middle of rice paddies. Yeah, if you hadn't seen a rice paddy, it's where they grow rice, and it's usually about 1 foot to 18 inches deep in water, and they've got little dikes around them to hold the water in. And it's wet and miserable. So we jumped off into that in the dark and set up a blocking position, and hadn't been there but just about 2 minutes and a firefight broke out. But we had a firefight for a while, and then the enemy kind of pulled back, and we assessed where we were and said, well, this position is about as good as any we can be in, so we settled in for the night. And then the rain started. They have monsoons in Vietnam. They have a period of time when it just rains forever. And it was that time of year, and it started raining and it was cold. And we'd wrap up in our poncho liner, which was the only thing we had to act like a blanket, and lay on the rice dike. At least you weren't laying in the water. Well, about every hour, some more enemy soldiers would come by, and we'd see them coming, and we'd roll off into the water or behind the dike and have another firefight for a while, and they'd run off and go another way because they couldn't get through us. And then we'd get back up on the rice dike and lay there shivering. The only sound you could hear at that point was the guys' teeth chattering all up and down the dike. So that night, I remember to this day as one of the coldest, most miserable nights I've ever spent. Irony of war. Everybody who served in Vietnam, and really in any other war, has stories like these. There's one other thing that we have in common.